Hello, I'm Joanne Gallagher, your Think.Future podcast host. Today I'm talking to Jim Goddin, Head of Circular Economy at ThinkStep ANZ, who joins us to tell us about the new international standard ISO 59020 and keeps us in the loop about the Materials Circularity Indicator he played a pivotal role in developing. Join us in a minute to hear more. This podcast is brought to you by Arcons, a global leader pioneering solutions and services to the AEC and manufacturing industries who support digital transformation for the built environment and smart manufacturing. Visit arcons.net to learn more about how Arcons are helping organizations design, build and solve through digitalization. From Arcons to you, welcome to our Think Future podcast series. Each week we'll share conversations with industry leaders from around the world to find out how they're thinking future. Subscribe to Arcons Think Future for access to more episodes, interviews and profiles. Jim Goddin is Head of Circular Economy at ThinkStep ANZ and is a distinguished materials engineer and a strategic advisor at the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining. He has been at the forefront of the circular economy, eco-design and addressing supply risks, collaborating with prestigious organisations such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Jim has worked closely with leading advanced manufacturers across various technologies, integrating circular economy metrics into industries including aerospace, automotive, medical devices, construction, food, textiles and packaging. As a member of the Critical Minerals Expert Committee, he has been actively involved in shaping the UK's critical minerals strategy. Hello, Jim. Welcome to the programme.
Hi.
So, Jim, you are the Head of Circular Economy at ThinkStep. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to be in this position?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a materials engineer by background. So I started off doing materials science and engineering and spent the first 10 years of my career in construction sector, working for the Building Research Establishment in the UK, working on a wide range of sort of materials challenges around the construction sector, but particularly around service life assessment, so how we extend the service life of structures and buildings, and on failures, material failures. I then moved into a Cambridge spin-out called Granta Design, who were focused on managing complex materials information. So I led collaborative R&D for that company for the next 10 years of my career. And through that, I worked on a wide range of technologies, including additive manufacturing, nanomaterials, composites, coatings, a lot on substitution, so substituting materials, particularly ones that were subject to restricted substances legislations, for example. But through that, a lot of my projects involved a strong thread of sustainability. So we were trying to embed sustainability metrics into standard engineering design processes. So trying to consider sustainability much earlier in the design process. And that led me through the integration of life cycle assessment into engineering design. Also the use of other metrics, such as around, I mentioned earlier, in terms of restricted substances and critical materials, which was something that came up in around 2010 when we had the rare earths crisis from China. And also through a chance interaction I had with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation just after they got started. We hit on the idea of circular economy metrics, and we needed a way of being able to compare different circular economy strategies as part of the design process. And the challenge we had was that a lot of the metrics were very different. So if you look at assessing a reuse-based model, you'd be looking at the number of reuses potentially, or a durability-based model will be based on the lifetime of the product. Recycling-based model will be based on the recycled content. So it becomes very difficult to compare different circular strategies against each other in a way that's comprehensive and fair to the different models. So we developed a project that would develop the first Materials Circularity Indicator, and it's actually called the Materials Circularity Indicator, with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That was published in 2015. I then led the update of that in 2019, and through that have become involved more extensively in the circular economy metrics area. So I'm part of an ISO committee on circularity metrics. I'm involved with the circularity transition indicators through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I've still continued my interest in critical minerals and critical materials. As part of that, there's a very interesting intersection between the circular economy, which is a way of retaining value in materials, and critical minerals and critical materials, which is one of the areas that we want to retain value in because we have restrictions in supply and availability and access to those materials. So since then, for the last 3.5 years, I've been working for ThinkStep, mostly remotely from the UK, but I've just moved over to Christchurch in New Zealand 6 months ago. So I'm now here on the ground in the same time zone, which is really nice.
Great. So Jim, you mentioned critical materials. So for people who might not know, what is that? Is it how you define it?
Yeah, so we have critical materials and we have critical minerals, and there is a difference between the two. So critical minerals are the things we dig out of the ground generally, things like lithium and cobalt and tungsten and tantalum, the individual elements that are extracted from the ground and refined. And those critical minerals are an area of concern for governments in particular. It's a focal point for trade agreements. A lot of the materials we need access to are produced elsewhere, and there are areas of supply concentration where there's almost monopolistic behavior around the production of those. And then we have critical materials, which is the application side. So from a business end, the materials that we use, which generally are combinations of those critical minerals. So if you think about the steels that we use in construction or automotive or aerospace alloys, they use combinations of those elements that then together form a very particular function. So they provide the material properties that are specific to that application. And generally, in those areas where critical minerals are used, the critical materials are very niche. They have very specific properties that can't be achieved through other applications. So the criticality relates to the supply concentration, the mismatch between supply and demand. So a lot of the materials we're using for renewable technologies, for example, we haven't had to produce at the scale that we need them now. And it also relates to a wide variety of other factors that can impact on the supply of those materials. So those could be geopolitical in nature. They could be linked to climate change. They could be linked to the ethical procurement of those materials, or to just the economics and the price volatility that's associated with the emerging applications that demand those materials that we need for other applications as well. So critical materials is an area where we have a lot of materials that we require for these new technologies. We're having to source them from a smaller number of areas, and those areas are subject to supply restrictions that can make it hard for us to get hold of the materials in the volumes that we need or at the prices that we need, or where there is generally a lot of competition for those resources.
Well, that takes sustainability to a sort of a different level, really, doesn't it?
It brings in an awful lot of different threads that all kind of come together. And that's one of the fascinating things about it, because it's a changing field. You know, the critical minerals we'll be concerned about in 10 years' time probably aren't critical now. And the ones that we are concerned about now probably will have been resolved to some extent in the next decade. So it's a changing field, and those sources of risk are very different and evolving. So it's something we have to be mindful of, and it does again intersect with the circular economy, because how we design those materials to be used and how we subsequently use them will impact the criticality not just now but down the line as well in terms of our future access. So if we design products that contain critical minerals to be reused or to last longer, that can effectively decouple us from those future supply risks, because we won't need as much of those materials further down the line.
So Jim, you mentioned offline that you worked with University in Stockholm, KTH. Can you go into what that collaboration was about and what was involved there?
Yeah, sure. So the collaboration with KTH really came about as a follow-up project to the initial indicators project with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and it was the second project I had with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So the indicators we started off with were really useful from a design perspective, But we were aware that the data really needed to be updated throughout the life cycle of the product. So as you went from a design concept where you might be using approximate data or data that you had estimated for recycling rates or reuse rates, you're using assumptions based on the model and the efficacy of the model that's going to apply. And we were interested in how we could tie into other data management systems, particularly around business data. So how could we capture actual data on product returns, on the durability or the reuse of actual components within the business? And how could we tie that through into the metrics so that we had an evolving picture? So we'd have the initial starting point as a design concept. That's the design of the product as well as the business model and how that business model would perform. We then wanted to be able to update that to be able to reflect reality and understand where the mismatch was and where the intervention points could be identified so that we could continue to iterate as the product went through its design life to improve and enhance the circularity as part of that.
That is interesting. Maybe we can go into a little bit more about that later when you mentioned the standard. There's a new standard coming out, is that right?
Yeah, so there's actually there's a collection of standards. And so the standards under TC 323, which I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years, there's ISO 59020. And I think you picked one of your previous sessions, picked up on that standard and some of the sister standards to that. So ISO 004, we have ISO 040, which is coming through the works as well. So they're not very exciting, these ISO numbers, but the content behind them is useful. And what ISO 59020 does is provide a common basis for some of these metrics. So it goes through not necessarily how you quantify it at the end point, but it provides guidance on some of the sub-indicators within circular economy. So things that are important to measure and to quantify and how to bring those together. And also some of the complementary indicators. So when we talk about circularity, we're generally talking about how we quantify the flow of materials and the extent to which we've decoupled from the consumption of non-renewable resources, the extent to which we've decoupled from the production of waste, and the extent to which we've extended the service life and so avoided the need for new materials. So that quantification of circularity is useful in itself, but it is even more useful if we start using it with other metrics such as the environmental impact or the social impact or the economic impact. What we didn't have was a metric that worked across all the different circularity models. So the Materials Circularity Indicator really focused in on that quantification and then using that against other metrics to try and have that systemic view of where the trade-offs were between improving circularity and in achieving the environmental, economic, and social benefits that we seek from circular economy systems. And I think the ISO standard 59020 really picks that up. So it identifies some of the adjacent standards that already exist for life cycle assessment or life cycle costing or social benefits. And it, rather than redefining those, it references those standards and places the circular economy against those areas of improvement and provides that basis for really moving towards a more solid and well-rounded assessment of the circular economy, which is why it's quite exciting to see that standard coming out, hopefully in the next couple of months.
It's very exciting. There's a lot going on. But I want to bring it back to very basics. You know, the definition of circular economy, I assume, is the same across these standards. Can you tell us, in your words, what you define circular economy as opposed to decoupling it from recycling and so on?
Yeah, so the circular economy is a more holistic view, and it's really a question of what drives the circular economy. One of the challenges with the circular economy is that in the first 5 minutes, the economy word has been forgotten altogether, and circularity has been reduced down to recycling. Now, the circular economy is being called the circular economy for a reason, and it's one of the benefits of the term that I think has made the circular economy resonate with industry more effectively than Cradle to Cradle did. Cradle to Cradle, the circular economy as a concept isn't new. The idea of reusing and remanufacturing products and recycling products isn't a new one. But the economic rationale and the justification for circularity is what I think has really made the circular economy stand out. So I think the first thing to realize with the circular economy is that it is an economic model. It is driven by value retention. How do we recapture the value in products? And that value comes from multiple sources. It can be in the materials themselves through which we recapture through recycling. But more often than not, for a lot of products, the value is actually more significant through the manufacturing process. So we take relatively low value materials, we manufacture those into components and into products, and into products that serve functions and services. And that process of turning materials into products adds value. And a lot of the value that we want to recover is actually from the manufacturing and the installation of those products. So the circular economy is a way of focusing our attention on how we recover that value, and at the same time decouple that value from the consumption of raw materials and the production of waste and all of the environmental and social impacts that goes with that. Because we are massively wasteful as a society. We consume huge amounts of resources, and most of those are consumed in a very linear fashion. So we dig stuff out of the ground, we use it, and we throw it away, which is massively wasteful, not just from an environmental standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. So the circular economy is how we bring that together and rethink these systems in a way that enables us to retain the greater portion of that value, and through that process deliver the environmental, economic, and social benefits that society needs.
Great. And does that mean that keeping these products in service somehow for longer? So we're talking about products made from materials and minerals. Are you talking about keeping them at the highest value so that they stay in service in those areas that they're needed in for the longest time?
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned the inner loop of the circular economy. What is that?
Yeah, I guess it's a term that possibly doesn't get used as much. But when we talk about the different models within the circular economy, we quite often talk about cascades. And it's a cascade from the inner loops through to the outer loops. So the starting point for the circular economy really should be, how do we keep products in service? But how do we keep products in service for longer? How do we reuse them? If we can't reuse them directly and they need repair, how do we repair or remanufacture those? Because that draws on the least quantity of materials to keep that product in service. It produces the least amount of waste. And quite often I also talk about supply-led and demand-led interventions. If we talk about recycling, that's really a supply-led intervention in the circular economy sense, because we're trying to ensure the equivalent flow of material back into the system through the recycling process. So rather than drawing it from virgin resources, we're recycling it to ensure that we can continue consuming at the levels we are. Demand-led interventions include things like durability and reuse, where by spreading the service life of a product over a longer period, we effectively decouple from the demand for that material to a higher extent. So if you make a product last twice as long, effectively you need half as much material to serve the same function. You don't have to produce a second one to replace it. If you can make it last 3 times as long as a third. So these are some of the things that kind of come into those metrics. But as we move from those durability and reuse-based models through to recycling, we're essentially going from the inner loops to the outer loops of the circular economy, and following the degradation of value and the increasing environmental impacts that tend to happen in that direction.
There's so many pieces, isn't it? It's just sort of engineering the whole thing so you get the best value along the way, whether it's recycling or reusing, or it's just different approaches depending on what you need to extract, isn't it? It's complex.
I think that's one of the things with the circular economy is it is highly contextual. What makes sense for one business and one location won't necessarily make sense for another. It's easy to have an assumption that circular economy models will always yield environmental or economic benefits. Quite often they don't. We can envisage models which are highly circular, but which include larger environmental impacts from additional transportation, for example, or from using more durable materials that come with a larger carbon footprint. Now, really we would hope that if we're using a more durable material, the impact per year or per use would be spread out and would actually end up with a more beneficial system. But those systems, as I said, are all highly contextual. If we try and apply a system in a city where the transport distances are shorter, that a model might work out in that environment. If we apply it in Australia, where we have much larger transportation distances, the environmental impacts associated with transport might be higher. The system may not work beneficially in that context. Now, the question is, should we be focusing on recycling-based systems instead of that, or should we be focusing on shifting transportation to low-carbon electric vehicles so that the environmental impacts for reuse and transportation come down? That's part of that systemic view where we have to consider the broader system that's in play, not just the product itself, but the system it sits within. And that includes logistics and storage and transportation, and also the users. Are we trying to make products last longer when more efficient versions are going to come out in a few years' time? These are all things that we have to try and consider holistically and understand what the optimal solution is.
Okay. We're going to take a short break to tell you a little bit more about our cons, and then we'll be right back to the conversation. Archons has a mission to advance the efficiency, quality and profitability of project outcomes for its customers by providing best-in-class technology and services. If you're looking for a digitalization and sustainability-focused partner to help you achieve your goals, join the thousands of AEC and manufacturing customers globally who have turned to Archons to start their journey toward a better built environment and smarter manufacturing. With more than 50 locations around the world, Archons can connect you to the right technologies and expertise so you can improve your competitive position and increase profitability. Archons has an industry expert to help you navigate the best pathway forward wherever you are on your digitalization and sustainability journey. Visit archons.net to find out more. And now back to our conversation. So from the business case, what is the opportunity and hotspots? What are the things that companies might not understand that or not know that they should know? Can you go into that a little bit more?
I think the challenge with a lot of businesses' approach to the circular economy is, I suppose there's a couple of areas. So I think from a business perspective, the companies we see moving most rapidly in the circular economy space tend to either be larger businesses which have a strong CEO who's bought into the circular economy concept and has decided that's the direction they're going to take. Or they tend to be smaller startups who have embedded circular economy thinking as their starting point. So it's part of their makeup. Generally, moving businesses from linear to circular is quite challenging. Larger businesses tend to have more embedded systems. They have particular patterns of work that they may have been following for decades. They have supply chains that are dependent on that pattern of work. They have employees who are trained to follow that pattern. So reorienting around a circular business model is actually quite challenging for some of those businesses. And again, some of the standards we have coming out help with that. So the ISO 59010 specifically deals with that transition. So it's guidance on the transition of business models and value networks, which I think provides a really good sort of reference point for how business can go about reorienting itself and looking at the capabilities that it has and the responsibilities that exist within its business and how they actually move that. So there is the logistical challenge of how you reorient a business from a linear model to a circular model. I think there's also the conceptual challenge, because there is a bit of a conflation of terms, I guess. When we talk about circular economy, a lot of people who work in the circular economy space have come from sustainability, including myself. And it's very easy to just see circular economy as, that's recycling. It's resource efficiency, it's sustainability under another name. And again, that comes down to that immediate discarding of the economics from the term circular economy. And I think it's really important for businesses to realize that the circular economy is really an important part of risk management. And that's risk from a wide range of different perspectives. So we have elements of the circular economy that deal with substances, hazardous substances in our product, and we have legislations that are forcing the prohibition of some substances that we've relied on for decades. So that is a risk to our business. Shifting to a circular economy or adopting a circular economy mindset is one of the ways of trying to resolve that risk or mitigate that risk. Critical materials we mentioned earlier is a supply risk. Same thing. If we think about it from a circular economy perspective, we're starting to design out those risks. Likewise, with ethical risk, we have conflict minerals, which are a handful of minerals that are sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo, primarily, but might be extended to include other areas which are associated with fueling conflict and civil rights abuses. We have a large number of countries that still rely on child labour for production of a lot of these materials. Again, focusing on the circular economy and how we reuse those materials is a way of decoupling from those types of ethical and reputational risks. We have a growing consumer interest in low carbon futures. How do we live more sustainably? Again, a lot of that focuses on waste, particularly when it comes to things like plastics and packaging, which are highly visible. Having a circular economy approach is a way of demonstrating to consumers that we can reuse these materials in a way that is more responsible, that delivers the objectives of lower pollution in the environment. So all of these risks kind of converge in that circular economy space, and it's one of the areas, one of the reasons why the circular economy really appealed to me from an early stage, is because it does bring in that really holistic view that does align with business value. We should be looking at the circular economy as an economic model. It is, generally speaking, within everybody's job description to manage risk within a business. And if we look at the circular economy from a risk perspective, it makes perfect sense that we should be looking at it from that perspective. We should be looking at circular economy models. We should be looking at how it benefits our business and our risk profile, and almost considering the environmental benefits as a bit of a side effect. Now, it's an important side effect, and it's one that a lot of us are pursuing. But you can almost put it to the side and say, well, the environmental benefits, we need to assess those. We need to understand that we're not going to make a system that's less environmentally beneficial, that has greater impacts. Okay, we need to make sure that's the case. But really, the core focus should be, how do we improve the circularity of our system? How do we decouple from risk? And recognizing that a lot of those risks are actually environmental in nature as well.
I've asked you maybe to have a listen to that other podcast. Did you get a chance, Jim, to listen to that one? So I would like to say, if you could relate your standard to these other sister standards and say what the main differences are, so that people are aware of them and that they know what to use them for.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed that podcast. The main focal point of that was ISO 59004, which is vocabulary, principles, and guidance for implementation, which is kind of the overarching reference point for a lot of the standards under ISO TC 323. So it provides the common frame of reference really for those standards. So there's a lot of disagreement in terms of the terms we use around the circular economy. Circular economy means different things to different people. It has a different boundary, I guess, in terms of what we consider within the circular economy. So that standard really sets the common vocabulary. It defines what we mean when we say circular economy, when we talk about regenerative production. Those are all now classified as specific terms, and we have a common frame of reference. It also provided the common set of principles that we're trying to achieve, which were systems thinking, value creation, value sharing, resource stewardship, resource traceability, and ecosystem resilience, which are all important facets that we're trying to deliver. And we have to try and deliver all of those, right? Those are 6 principles that we are trying to achieve through the circular economy model. Now, the standard I've been working off really ties into the measurement of circularity. So how do we quantify the circularity of materials and products and businesses and economies? Because we also have things like the Circularity Gap Reporting Initiative, which is one of the leading ways of defining the circularity of a city or a country. So the ISO 59020 really provides the common reference for indicators like the Materials Circularity Indicator or the Circular Transition Indicators or the Circularity Gap Reporting Initiative. It provides a common reference of the components that need to be considered, which components are mandatory, which components are optional, and how to start bringing those together and how to define things like the boundary conditions. How do we understand the extent of the system we're considering? Where does it start? Where does it stop? How do we deal with temporal issues, in terms of the lifespan of our products? Are we considering it just now, or are we considering it over the next 5 years or 10 years? How many uses of the product? These are the sorts of things that need to be resolved, and we need a common frame of reference for. Alongside that, we then have ISO 59010, which is guidance on the transition of business models and value networks, which is more about the implementation. So that standard draws on the other two and provides a process for a business to run through to understand where it is today, what areas it's going to prioritize in terms of its circular economy journey, how it's going to measure those, how it's going to work with other value chain actors in its supply chain, so stakeholders that may be upstream or downstream or tangential, and how to bring about that process of continuous improvement, where we're not just focusing on a small incremental one-off change, but a process that continues and becomes ever more circular as we run through it. So that draws on those other standards, because obviously as part of understanding where you are and where you're going to, you need to be able to use circularity metrics. You need to have reference to those 6 principles in the other standard. So it really starts to form a really cohesive picture of what we're trying to do, how we measure it, how we actually deliver it. And those standards kind of come together. And there are other standards that are still in the works around that that relate to digital product passports, circularity data sets, because data is obviously an important part. But those are standards that we'll see coming out over the coming years, and they relate to these other particular facets of the circular economy that we need, again, standardized guidance on.
Wow, that's a lot. But those 3 that you mentioned there really help to explain the scope. Yeah, one's overarching, the other 2, how things are played out then in the industry. Some guidelines for that. That's good. So, Jim, how is success measured using the standard? What sort of data are you collecting, and how are you collecting it?
Success in the light of the circular economy is a difficult one. I guess it comes back to this question of what the objective is and the mindset you approach it from. I think it's wrong to approach the circular economy from a binary perspective, where we're talking about something that's either linear or circular. There are different levels of circularity, and very few products are going to be perfectly circular. A lot of products will be somewhere in between. They'll be somewhere between 0 and 100%. It doesn't mean 100% shouldn't be the goal where it makes sense, but there is that trade-off. We have to understand the trade-offs between improving the circularity and improving the environmental, economic, and social benefits from the system. So we need to understand what's practical. So I think from my perspective, what success actually looks like is adopting that continuous improvement mindset. So it's accepting that this is a journey, that we are moving from a highly linear system to a more circular system, that we're going to target the things that make the biggest difference first. So we're going to look at our system, understand where the biggest benefits can be reaped soonest, and prioritize those. But we're also going to continue to work on those other areas which are less impactful but still important. And we're going to continue to assess and process those. We're going to continue to evolve our product and our business that provides those benefits through to our users. And we're going to communicate that. So communication is a huge part of the circular economy and a very important part. And not just in terms of having a certificate or having a rating, but really bringing the user on that journey. Because a lot of things we're trying to deliver through the circular economy are difficult. They're going to take time. But I think, generally speaking, the consumer appreciates transparency in terms of what a business is doing now and what it's trying to do and how it's trying to get there. And that means communicating successes as well as failures, understanding and communicating what our strategy is, recognizing that we have a certain impact today, that we're going to try and do these things that we've calculated are going to improve our system, and then reporting on whether they actually have or not, and reflecting on the parts of our story that we thought were true that might not be, or the realities of the system that we perhaps thought were different, and then talking about what we're going to do next. So I think that there's a huge communication pass around the circular economy, and having that openness around discussion underpinned by solid metrics and data to show that we're not just making things up. We actually have the data to back it up, but that we're approaching that from an unveiling of the story of our product and of the evolution of our business. I think is really important. And I think that behind that, there's a whole range of other benefits that we're only really just beginning to think about. I mean, if you think about the things that we tend to own and look after in our lives, these are things that tend to have a story attached to them. They have some provenance. I have a grandfather clock that I've ended up with that has we don't use it very much. It tells the time okay, but there are modern alternatives that are much more accurate and don't make so much noise. But we look after it and we maintain it because it has a story. I got it from my father. He got it from his father. We know where it's been. We can imagine all the people who have been around it, and the things we look after have a story. They have context. And there's been some great examples of starting to use that context to add value to products. I think Oxfam did a really good study 10, 15 years ago about products that were donated to their charity shops, and attaching some of the background to those products that were donated massively increased the sale rates of those products, because they weren't just random things on a shelf anymore. They were things that were owned by someone where you could access part of the story behind it. It had more meaning and more value because of that. And I think we're only just beginning to look into how we move beyond things like digital product passports as purely a reporting mechanism through to, actually, this is a core part of the value of our product. The fact it has this provenance, that we know who owned it before, where it's been, the fact that this backpack that I'm buying secondhand from a store has been up to base camp in Everest, or has been sat on by multiple people on their years out. These things kind of provide more of the pleasure and the enjoyment. It's not just about function. It's about the storytelling and the passion that goes behind these things. What goes into manufacturing them? The people who the production and sale of this particular product may have helped put someone's kid through college. Unless we can tie that to the product, that we don't perceive that value, it's kind of lost. And it might be really important to someone who's trying to make a decision between buying something secondhand and buying something new.
I agree. I always say there's soul in this, a bit of story and soul behind the things I have. That's why I like old things, and especially handmade things. One question about water circularity. Arcons is partner in the Circularity Accelerator program with the World Green Building Council, and they published a paper on water recently. We want to encourage resilience and water circularity when it comes to manufacturing. Have you got any thoughts on that in the broader context of manufacturing?
Yeah, I guess water in the circular economy has been one of those areas that's been recognised all along as being very important. But it's been a bit of a niche area, I guess. But it is a very relevant area. I mean, we do consume massive amounts of water through material production and manufacturing. It is a key resource, and it is in many regions a resource that is stretched and depleted. So, approaching that from a circular economy perspective makes an awful lot of sense. It is one of the metrics that is picked up as a complementary metric within the ISO standard. It's certainly something that we should be considering. The challenge, again, I guess, when we come down to things like regenerative sourcing, which I mentioned earlier, it is highly contextual. We're interested in the volume, of course. We're interested in the amount of water we're using that is recycled or reused, as opposed to being extracted from the environment. We're also interested in the quality of the water that we might be releasing back into the environment. But a litre of water in New Zealand is different from a litre of water in Australia, different from a litre of water in the Sahara Desert. And the importance is different. Should we be spending as much recovering water in an area which is abundant in water as opposed to an area that isn't? There are all these questions that kind of underpin the circularity that we're trying to apply to water systems, because it's not a fixed, there's no fixed bar. And there is this trade-off, I guess, between water and the environmental impacts of just taking clean, plentiful water that might have fallen from the sky on the roof of your factory, or spending more energy to clean and purify and reuse water that you may not necessarily have to from an economic perspective. So I think you can apply circular economy metrics to water, but I think there are more intricacies around how you do that and what good circularity looks like against these other metrics that we need to consider. And as I said, it's very very similar in that respect to regenerative sourcing of materials, and what really looks like a good circular model is still a bit open, a little bit fuzzy, a bit open to interpretation, but it is a very important aspect that we should be considering. And you can consider it through things like the Materials Circularity Indicator or the Circular Transition Indicators. There are allowances for that. You can just treat it as another material that is going through your process that you need to manage and understand the circularity of. And it is, as I said, is included in the ISO standard as one of the optional metrics. But it's an area that I think it needs quite a lot more additional focus. We need to really have a clear view on what success for circularity of water actually looks like.
Yes, it's very important. Without water, we can't really make anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, water for life. So as we close out today's conversation, Jim, when you think future about the circular economy as a lever for sustainability, what is it that excites you the most?
That's a difficult one. I think for in terms of excitement, I get excited by the systemic nature of circular economy. I don't like thinking about just one thing. I like jumping from one topic to another, from one sector to another, from one technology to another. I find the circular economy exciting because it enables me to do that. There are lots of things we can learn from completely different systems, from completely different manufacturing bases, from completely different contexts. So I think there's a lot of regional context, how the circular economy sits in national psyches. If we look at how the circular economy exists in Japan versus New Zealand versus the EU, it's subtly but very fundamentally different. It sits in a different place in the psyche, and people react to it differently. And in some places, it's a more natural fit, and in other places, it isn't. So I think the systemic and holistic nature, and the fact that it brings together so many different things that we're trying to resolve, is the thing that really I find exciting from a technical perspective. From another perspective, as we mentioned around the tales of things and the stories behind stuff, I think there's a much more fundamental level behind the circular economy that really talks to our aspirations as people. What do we aspire to? What is important for us? What are the markers of success? To start to question why that exists and what it means to us individually from our own markers of success, to potentially decouple from some of those egotistical parts of consumption that make us go out and buy something new when we have the money rather than enjoying what we have. And I think that is a real fundamental challenge, and I think it redefines what we're trying to get to. What is the end point for the circular economy? Why should we aspire to it? And I think we're kind of missing a little bit of that. Is from a personal perspective, what is the aspiration to circularity look like? What is the aspiration towards reuse? What is the aspiration to a less consumptive behavior? And I think for me, that's the really fascinating thing that sits behind the circular economy. Putting aside all the technical aspects and the materials and the manufacturing and the logistics and the trade aspects of it, from a personal level, what is it that we should be aspiring to that promotes circularity? And it's a fascinating question to ask people. So I think for me personally, a lot of that sits behind the circular economy, although it's not really what the circular economy is about. From a technical perspective, it underlies that, and we need a clearer idea of what that is to really want to aspire to circularity from a personal perspective.
Well, great. Thanks for telling us that. You're really touching into my own personal values and vision for a sustainable, thriving world. Thanks for the conversation today, Jim, and keeping us in the loop on everything that matters around material science.
Yeah, it's been great fun and really, really good to talk to you. Thanks for inviting me along.
This podcast was brought to you by Arcons. Arcons is leading the digital transformation of the AEC and manufacturing industries By providing best-in-class technology solutions from world-leading partners and their own in-house development software from the Archon's BeSmart portfolio for building, infrastructure and manufacturing. Archons is a company that cares about creating and building a better world. Together, we are working with industry and environmental experts, providing forums and platforms through our Archons Think community to create conversations that matter to our future generations. We invite you to join in the conversation and participate in our Think community. Like and subscribe to Think.Future to stay up to date with the latest innovations and conversations as we advance the digital journey for the AEC and manufacturing around the world. You can download our podcasts at archons.net or from your favourite podcast platform.